Well, as the debate on the Expropriation Act rages on, let's unpack some of the fine print in the legislation. What we know so far is the new act repeals the pre-democratic Expropriation Act of 1975. It also sets out how organs of state may expropriate land in the public interest for varied reasons. Furthermore, the Presidency has said that this new act aligns with Section 25 of the Constitution. But there are some quarters who've already indicated intentions to challenge the new act, as we've heard previously. Well, to take us through some of the nitty-gritties of the Act, I'm joined in studio by Bulelwa Mabasa. She's the head of land reform at Werksmans Attorneys. Thank you so much for joining us, Bulelwa.
It's a pleasure.
Good stuff. So, the latest Expropriation Act repeals the old Act. Just tell us what the fundamental difference is in the new law.
Well, the 1975 Act predates the Constitution, obviously. That legislation has been in place for 50 years. So what happened was when the Constitution was then promulgated in 1996, the 1975 Act, you would imagine, was not in line with the Constitution. So the 1975 Act made provision for willing buyer, willing seller, which is market value compensation, whilst on the other hand, the Constitution makes provision for just and equitable compensation. Now, the difference between the two is that market value simply is what the market value price is in terms of the market. However, the just and equitable principle looks at the current use of the property, the history of the acquisition. Was it paid for? Was it a crown grant from the previous government? It looks at whether or not there were some investments, improvements on the property, and the purpose for the expropriation. So if you like, the just and equitable compensation concept brings along with it some historical context to it. That's one of the fundamental changes, but it's not the only one. What also was problematic with the 1975 Act is that it didn't give so much audi or the right to be heard by the party that's being expropriated. And so this legislation also builds in a multitude of layers of safeguards. So in other words, the state can't just come to you and say they're going to expropriate. They need to send a notice of intention to expropriate. They need to show suitability for the expropriation. They need to have gone through a myriad of processes that includes reports from the municipal manager, the DG, Land Reform Department, Environment, and so forth. So it builds into it quite a significantly symbiotic, almost negotiated kind of process. And of course, the party that's being expropriated has a right to object to the expropriation itself and also to the amount of compensation that is being offered. You have a mediation procedure that is being introduced, and also there's recourse in terms of the courts of law.
You've answered so many of the questions that I have for you, but with that, let me just ask you the question, under what circumstances can a government entity eye a piece of land for appropriation or expropriation? Under what circumstances? So
that's a very important question. I think the first general principle is to say that expropriation is not meant to disrupt the society. It's not meant to disrupt economic activity. So properties that would be subject to expropriation would include things like land or property where the landowner has abandoned the land. In other words, the landowner is not traceable. I think of examples of what's been happening in the inner city buildings, where buildings have gone up in flames and lives have been lost. Those are instances where landowners have actually abandoned their legal obligations to keep properties safe. Those would be, in my view, the properties that are susceptible to expropriation, where there is, for example, state organs. We have a lot of state organs that own buildings and land which they don't typically need to use in order to provide service delivery. It's not part of their core functions to have this, all this land. So that's another scenario where expropriation without compensation could potentially occur. But I think it's the important message to send out to the public is that expropriation is there isn't a wholesale general desire for the state to expropriate land that is productive, that is being used, where there's job creation, and land that is productive for different purposes, for residential purposes, for commercial purposes. So when land is productive, and it's already serving a purpose, it's not going to be susceptible to expropriation.
Yeah, no, that clarity is very, very helpful indeed. Now, we know that there's some quarters that are opposed to this act and have already indicated that they're going to go to the Constitutional Court to fight it. Do you think that there's any prospect of success? The President says that this act is in alignment with the Constitution.
Look, this act has gone through so many iterations. I think we started speaking about the expropriation bill 15 years ago. I sat as a member of the Presidential Advisory Panel for Land Reform as an attorney there, and we recommended that it was high time that we have an Expropriation Act that is aligned with the Constitution. It also serves a very important message to capital and investors. It provides the clarity that there isn't this intention to disrupt our economy. Our economy is at a space where it cannot afford to have, kind of ambiguity and disruptions, and this is what the Act does. It provides that level of clarity. I personally, having looked at the substance of the legislation, I think if I'm being generous, I would say that there is nothing constitutionally defective. However, there could be a view that will say that our Constitution does not provide for expropriation without compensation as a rule. So therefore, the instances that I've just lined out that I said could lead to expropriation without compensation, those are contained in Section 12 to subsection 3. Those might be attacked on the basis that, but our Constitution doesn't allow for nil compensation.
Still linked to what you're saying very quickly as we run out of time. Under the circumstances where the government or government entity decides to go down the expropriation without compensation route, is this a decision that would have to be sanctioned by a court?
And like I said, so the process involves both parties negotiating. So there is a mediation process. When the mediation process fails, then either party has recourse to the courts. So it's the courts that will be available to either parties to decide on the suitability of the expropriation without compensation. Awesome. So it's not as if the government has the final say.
Thank you so much, Bulelwa, for your rich contribution to this discussion. That was Bulelwa Mabasa. She's the head of land reform at Werksmans Attorneys.